Perfect. So thanks everyone for coming to today's event. We're really lucky to host Dr. John Gunn from Laurentian University. I'll just start with a quick land acknowledgement. So Laurentian University is located on the traditional lands of the Atikamekw and Anishinaabeg, and the city of Sudbury also includes the traditional lands of the Wanapate First Nation. And McGill University in Montreal is a longstanding site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg nations. So we want to acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks the territory where we gather right now. And I also want to acknowledge that the climate crisis and restoration efforts that we'll be talking about today affect disproportionately Indigenous communities. And and then now I'll just introduce Dr. Gunn. He's the director of the Valley Living with Lake Center, where he runs a lab. He's a Laurentian faculty member in the Department of Biology and is a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Stressed Aquatic Systems. He worked as a senior research scientist at the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources for 25 years before Laurentian, and he's a founding member of the Cooperative Freshwater Ecology Unit. So thank you so much for being here. We're very lucky to have you, and personally, I'm very happy since I'm from Sudbury and went to Laurentian. I'm happy to be able that you can share this story with the McGill community. So I'll just hand it over to you, Dr. Gunn.
Thank you very much, and it is a very was a wonderful opportunity to be invited by the Minister from Montreal, Minister Guilbeault, to showcase the Sudbury story at the International COP meeting on December the 19th. And we received the prestigious spot. I either like to be first on the agenda or last on the agenda to be in the position to synthesize, but we were the final presentation in the Canada Pavilion, just as the tired negotiators were finishing at 3 a.m, trying to bring 190 countries together on an agreement for the Biodiversity Convention. So the story of Sudbury is being recognized as one of the great success stories on Earth. And there are a lot of superlatives here that we'll go into. We were, for instance, originally the largest point source of sulfur pollution on the planet, and at enormous concentrations. But in front of you now, what we're going to try to do today, and I'll leave some questions at the end if you wish, is how did this happen? How did we transform a blackened landscape that was so famous and called the moonscape, considered by many to be irreversibly destroyed, to this lush and green, lovely spot we see today? And what lessons can we learn to bring this to other countries? And I've traveled extensively around the world telling this story, whether in Russia or China or South Africa, Peru, and other places recently. And each time people take considerable hope out of seeing the worst of the worst becoming some of the best. So the COP conference happened in December there in Montreal, and it was 30 years since the creation of the Biodiversity Convention at the first real international environment conference, the Earth Summit Conference in Brazil. And at that conference, the city of Sudbury, for its reclamation and community engagement work, was given the Local Honors Award 30 years ago. So now, 30 years later, we're returning to the UN conference, and we're trying, the job I have in front of them and now in front of you guys is to convince you that progress beyond that has occurred, and then to try to tease out what were the reasons for that progress. Sudbury and the air pollution, disastrous conditions in Sudbury were front and center in the US-Canada negotiations in 1991. when, because of transboundary air pollution, Canada and the US were negotiating for more than 5 years for the amendments to the 1990 Clean Air Act. And I took a lot of pride that on coming home on the day of the signing of the Clean Air Act in the revisions in 1990, Michael Perley, who was the head of the Canadian delegation there in the Congress for 5 years, announced on Quirks and Quarks that the recovery story in Sudbury was instrumental in convincing the US that that was possible, because Sudbury was such a prominent, large industrial point source that the US kept saying, don't talk to us about our damages, our pollution, unless you deal with your own. And we can see it at an extreme case there in Sudbury. So we were shamed into, in a sense, cleaning up our act before anyone else would. So if there's anyone who doesn't know where that's located, it's about 600 kilometers due east for where you're sitting now from Montreal, about 400 kilometers north of Toronto. And Sudbury it has a very, very dark past. It's been a mining industrial city since the 1880s, and it was an extreme blight on the land, often called a moonscape for the level of damage that occurred there. But today, it's a clean and healthy city, and of 160,000 people in some of the cleanest air in Ontario, where the 30 lakes downtown are fishable and swimmable, and there's a considerable market garden. Now, your question has to be to me, how did that happen? Like, how can you bring such a destructive site into an area that can attract professionals for quality of life needs into the future? And can we make the argument that environmental quality leads to a community revitalization? Well, perhaps in Sudbury we can. You might make the argument that in the original condition, in the original damaged state, it may not have won the Nobel Prize in physics because professionals wouldn't want to associate it and the work there. Many of you will not know, but it's the 4th largest film festival in Canada after Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto is Sudbury. Why is there a booming film industry or a school of architecture or science centers in such a destroyed landscape? Because there is nowadays a clean association between, as I say, quality of life, environmental condition, and the prosperity of communities. So with Zoom being an example, you can run a business anywhere in the world. So why would you want to be in downtown Montreal when you can live in Sudbury? So let's go back to the original story. Sudbury was formed by an explosion, a meteorite impact 1.8 billion years ago. This is creating the 2nd largest crater on Earth. This is the same scale of the meteorite impact that destroyed the dinosaurs just a few years ago. But this is in 1.8 billion years ago when we were dealing with single cell organisms on Earth. And at the time, it was one large planet or one large landmass. And you can see it today in this image, the X-ray image of not the round black lake, but the image in the foreground is the outline of the crater. And if you look carefully in it, you can see the squares of the farmlands that are in the middle of the once lake that occupied that spot. But that crater was carved out to 15 kilometers below the surface of the Earth. And if you go to Upper Michigan, you'll find the rock fallout from the crater, nearly 45 meters thick of Sudbury rock laying on the land 500 kilometers away. So this is a massive explosion. The dark lake to the side is a second meteorite impact. That's Wanapitei Lake, where the Wanapitei First Nations folks live. And I always make the joke that we've been hit twice in the same spot by meteorites. So it could be today or any other day we're going to be hit by the third one just by chance alone. But this explosion, this impact, was then the source of the wealth that is going to drive the Tesla contracts of recent days. And it's going to be the battery source of the world in the near future because of that meteorite. So what a meteorite explosion does is liquefy the earth, and minerals concentrate along the edge of the bubble. And so when the system cooled down again, there was a rich concentration of ore encircling the crater, and not from the meteorite itself, but from the magma that was brought to the surface. And the one feature of this ore was both the source and the ultimate problem with the ore. It was super rich in metals of the whole periodic table, copper and nickel in particular, but it was also 30 to 40% sulfur. So the sulfur concentration was high enough that it was combustible. Like the smell of a match under your nose, you can light it on fire. And thus, in every industry today, what you're searching for is efficiency in energy use. Here, the explosion created an ore body where the energy was built into the ore. So you didn't need external sources of energy to extract and smelt it. So the ancient technologies of the 1880s were extremely crude. They stripped the forest cover and built fire pits of this sort, 1, 2, 3 kilometers long of massive wood piles, loaded the ore on top, and then simply lit it on fire. And this was hell on earth. These 11 roast pits burned the earth and just rolled the sulfuric acid fumes at ground level across the landscape, destroying everything in sight. That wasn't the worst of it. That was to come later, because the velocities in those, the smoke coming off those was not sufficient to lift vast amounts of metal particulates with it. But the early smelters came in the late 1890s, and here the fumes coming off the fires had enough velocity that it could carry thousands and thousands of tons of toxic metals with it to roll out over the landscape along with the sulfur. And we proudly became, at that point, eventually by the 1960s, as the largest point source of sulfur pollution on Earth at about 2.5 million tons. That's twice that all of Europe produces today, about a fifth of all of China. And that sulfur and the sulfur fumes combined with rain and created sulfuric acid, which burned the landscape down to the bedrock and etched the rock in this blackened form. And as you can see from the stumps, the soil washed away in the subsequent rains, and that more than a meter of soil washed into the low areas. So we were left with 80,000 hectares of barrens in this massive erosion. Now that's the area of the island.
I don't know that one.
Of Hong Kong. Be quiet there. So a very, very large area indeed. But that wasn't enraged the public and affected the protesters of the 60s, it was that long-range transport from that site was destroying people's recreational areas. So this is the magnificent landscape around Killarney. And the fumes from Sudbury were traveling thousands of kilometers and impacting the Adirondacks, crossing sometimes into Mexico, into Greenland. But in the local area, out to about 110 kilometers, it was burning the forest and destroying the thousands of populations of fish. So this is the footprint of the Sudbury impact. The center of the impact is the darker areas, are the blackened zones around the three major smelter areas. Then the darker shaded area is the area where the forest is largely eliminated. And the large footprint is where the lakes were damaged by the Sudbury Lake area. So 7,000 lakes in an area of 17,000 square kilometers. Now, on the day that I gave this presentation at COP15, I was talking about an area that was bigger than 40 countries that were upstairs negotiating for biodiversity conventions. So this is an area bigger than Connecticut. This is an area bigger than 40 countries on Earth. So no small story to present in front of the convention. But the first, as you may know, the first conference that really did discuss long-range transport was in Copenhagen in 1972. And that was lawyers like yourselves were from Sweden were taking the case to Germany and to Britain that the damages in their country were due to long-range transport. And out of that, the convention there was resolution number 18, which says, to paraphrase it, thou shalt not build tall smokestacks to pollute your neighbors. In the same year, ironically, Sudbury built the tallest smokestack on Earth, simply to pollute their neighbors and to stop the lawsuits that were happening from the farmers in that valley. In 1970, a $300,000 law case was taken up by farmers. That was an enormous amount in those days for damages. So 1972, we offended the whole world by producing the tallest smokestack on Earth. And luckily, with good regulations, that smokestack no longer operates and was decommissioned in 2 years ago in 2020. And it was decommissioned because of people like you guys. There was protesters of all sorts. There was Greenpeace scaling the smokestack all over Europe and other places. People were wearing the image of Sudbury and the superstack. And people finally got through to the government that finally got through to the industry. So today it's the opposite. It's the great success story on Earth. And one of the greatest images in the environmental literature is this one, is the emissions reduction achievements in Sudbury. Bringing the largest point source on Earth, 2.5 million tons. I think Japan today would be about 700,000 tons. You can see the scale of this effect. All the time, the company maintained or increased its production of nickel and copper. All the time, it improved the health of its workers. All the time, it increased its ESG scores. Legislation, regulations, as the Michael Porter hypothesis from Harvard states, that can affect the competitive nature of companies to the benefit of good companies. But the community, the company was thriving, but the community was left with the damage. So what can you do? So in 1978, the community engagement, mayors, active people decided you can't attract industries and professionals to such a city. You have to invest in rehabilitation, and it started as a make work job, employment, unemployment insurance, other ways of supporting it. 4,000 workers working on the hillsides, 13,000 volunteers. And to date, and the reason Dr. Jane Goodall came to Sudbury in July, and the minister was there, and when I met the minister, he invited me to give this talk at COP15, because the city has successfully, through its community engagement, planted 10 million trees and intensely treated 4,000 hectares of land through liming and seeding, the largest land reclamation site on Earth. So a local community neighborhood might have looked like this in 1980. By 1985, it looked like that. In 1990, it was there. In 95, 2000, and it looks like that today. So an incredible change that's happened with clean air and the community involvement. And so we think for a moment now as a group, what are the lessons we learned on this one? Well, the first one is leadership. We had leadership, and it doesn't have to be very many people in many of the sectors. And in the community engagement sector, Dr. Peter Beckett was a botanist at the university who gave his life to champion this land reclamation efforts. And what have they achieved? Well, if you take the bullseye in the middle of the area, they've now reached 50% of the suitable areas have been planted and regreened. And now in modern terms, there's other assets and other values that have generated here. It's not just aesthetics. 650,000 tons of carbon are sequestered in the regreened area. So if communities are able to get financial benefits from carbon credits or offset credits, these are places where they can invest. That's a very small fraction of the total amount of carbon accumulated, because it doesn't count the natural regeneration as a result of the clean air, and lots of trees and vegetation have come back naturally. So our estimates are well over 1 million tons of sequestered carbon in the reclaimed area. And at biodiversity conference, you want to know what species, so vast numbers of vascular plants, lichens, 50 species of that. Lichens, the little crusty things that form on rocks, are some of the best indicators of air quality. There were no lichens in the inner zone before. It was too sensitive. And now the area is richly covered with lichens, and one thing it does is change the color of the landscape. So it's not black anymore. The surface is white, and as a result, it doesn't absorb heat. So it's helping counteract climate effects through the natural colonization. I'm an aquatic scientist, primarily fish, so I focus on things like water quality. And if you take some of the lakes in the middle of the city and you try to work toward a goal of reaching provincial water quality objectives, in this case pH 6, you can see a vast range of trajectories in the different study lakes. But when that slide was only all but Wavy Lake have made it to pH 6 within the city core, and now Wavy is above that line. The same with toxic metals in the sediments. The goal is for metals like nickel or 25 micrograms per liter. And all of the lakes that we're studying are getting close to that provincial water quality objective. And in the aquatic environment, it was mainly aquatic battle that started in North America. People in Muskoka and Halifax and Adirondacks were outrage that acid rain was killing fish. And we've now been able to get 50% of the acid damaged lake trout lakes back. And one very special fish, the Aurora trout up in the top corner, which only lived in 2 lakes in the world. They were eliminated by acid rain, but saved in a hatchery breeding program. After 45 years, they were brought back to the lake and are now successfully reproducing. And that species has been removed from the endangered species list. So let's take a moment and think again what 40 years of lessons we might have learned from this story. The most important lesson I learned is that government and regulations have to be firm but fair. And none of this would have happened without a public voice and a good government, and setting regulations that are achievable. And whether we're talking today about the carbon tax or limits on carbon, in the day we set very firm limits on sulfur dioxide. And each time the limits were set, the companies were able to meet them. And this is Glencore company. They've not only met them, but they were actually able to increase their nickel production while meeting them. So there's a lot of waste in everything, and there's a huge amount of waste in industry. And it's up to legal minds like yourself and regulators to hold them accountable and be firm enough that the one argument the industry made is that we need time and everybody has to be treated the same. So regulations have to be fairly distributed among competing companies, and they need some sufficient time to make the innovations. And they make these innovations to the benefit of themselves always. So they're the usual way that pollution is dealt with is reducing cost on fuel. Every industry that uses excessive fuel is a dirty company. So the best measure of pollution is your fuel use. How much diesel, how much coal is a clear indication of how inefficient your company is, because those are expensive commodities and they're very wasteful in their use, in the same way that Ford Motors was very wasteful in the cars they built when I was a teenager. And Japanese car makers said, well, we can make a car that could run 3 times as far on a gallon of gas. And that's why I'm driving a Toyota now, because they're able to, once those regulations are put in place, clean companies can meet it, usually by managing pollution by fuel. So it's not follow the dollars, it's follow the fossil fuel. And you usually find the solution there. And these companies did that. They made their energy efficiency paid for all of the sulfur controls. So today they emphasize that what was the problem? It was their wastefulness. They had low productivity in their workers in nickel per worker. They had low productivity, energy efficiency. Why would you throw tens of thousands of tons of metals out as a pollutant when you actually sell it? Why would you send sulfur out the smokestack when you have a market for sulfuric acid? So when you look at your pollution source as commodity, then you can usually find efficiencies to deal with that. So this next lesson is that success in community work anyway is built on broad-based partnerships. At the community level, there's no time for blame, and everybody's contributions have to be valued, no how big or small they might be. And that's what Sudbury did in great measure. Is hundreds of different organizations, including the major industries, were brought to the table to work together to clean up the problems. And they engaged youth. There have been 50 ugliest schoolyard contests in Sudbury where you could nominate yourself as having the ugliest school, and you could win a contest to get support to reverse that. And there have been 50 schoolyards that have been regenerated in that contest, with lots of well-heeled donors wanting to put their name on the regenerated school. The other lesson in broad-base is our Indigenous communities have been badly treated in this area, as they have otherwise, and their lands within the municipality were equally badly damaged. But I brought to COP15, and one of the products of my meeting there was I met with the ministers, and I proposed that the Wolf Lake Reserve in Sudbury be one of the First Nations-led conservation areas in Ontario. And we're proceeding very quickly, getting support for this initiative. We're expecting the Minister Guilbeault will be here, and we might even take him on a canoe trip up to see the site, so that the area can be set aside as an ecotourism site for Indigenous youth to manage as a reserve. The other lesson was learning as we go. You can't find perfect solutions. So what we call adaptive management is that trial and error is another way to do it, but is doing things in a scientific and monitoring framework so that you can learn and apply efficiencies and improvements. And that has been very much the process of regreening Sudbury, is different combinations of fertilizer, lime, and treatments to try to maximize the benefits. For instance, why just focus on land if treating land could have a downstream benefit on water? So they've adapted their treatments to be watershed-based, so that liming of upstream areas benefits downstream conditions. And here's an example of one of the most aerially polluted lakes in the world at the time was Silver Lake. Has copper concentrations, as you can see, nearly 500 micrograms. The limit for copper is 1 or 5. And just by the upstream treatments, that lake has reversed itself incredibly, and sensitive fish have moved back in using a watershed connectivity approach. The other is that seeing diversity in all its form as valuable in people and also in plants. And so the original idea was, let's get trees growing as fast as possible and mimic plantation growth for forestry. And that leaves a barren landscape that's prone to fire and insect infestations. And so now they use a approach of bringing back the forest floor, and in this case, taking land that is proposed for destruction from highway development and transporting it in sods and bread trucks, and introducing species and allowing them to spread from those soon to be destroyed sites. The next lesson, lesson 6, is while you're doing all that, you have to engage your local universities, your local scientists, and look for real novel breakthroughs. So what we're looking at is a famous picture from Sudbury. You might know what it is, and some people might not imagine what it is. You might think that's lava or flowing across an industrial waste field. Sudbury is, from 100 years of mining now, has some of the largest waste piles in North America left over, covering areas as big as downtown Toronto in 50 meters of waste. And through that waste piles flows these colored rivers. Now that is life in all its bounty. What you're looking at is an explosion of iron oxide bacteria that are searching for alternate energy sources, just like the industry was looking for alternate energy. Here, a microbe is looking for energy in breaking the iron-sulfur bond. And it liberates ferrous iron, which is the bright red color. So that's not a hot stream. That's a cold stream full of life. But what it is a bacteria that is looking for that energy, and one of its byproducts of breaking those bonds is releasing the contaminants that are in the bond. So that waste pile contains $3.8 billion of leftover nickel. And now this brilliant scientist, Nadia Mikachuk, is engineering those bacteria to remine the landscape and produce the nickel for batteries, without ever opening another mine again, just simply processing those mine wastes with bacterial consortiums. Here's another brilliant woman, Jerusa, who's looking for, what is she looking for? She's looking for cancer drugs in the wastewater. And the one thing about extreme environments, it creates extreme solutions. And so if a green bacteria is growing in one of the most polluted streams in Sudbury, how do they survive in the face of all those iron and toxic metals? Well, they toughen themselves. They build thicker and thicker walls to deal with acidity. They build enzyme systems that can deal with that. And now, lo and behold, those products are useful to us. And Jerusa is finding that the extracts from these algae are very effective at treating breast cancer cells without damaging the healthy cells. They're also making biofuels out of the waste stream that the extremophiles are generating. So that's a case where the extreme environments and the extreme has the chance of having extreme science breakthroughs. Well, what I'm doing today is what I have to do every day, is I have to report on this stuff so that you guys will do something useful with it. You don't just stick it in your notebook. And so reporting and monitoring, we have to prove that emissions reductions and legislation and regulations, we had to prove to the United States that you could regulate your industry without resorting to a lifetime of remedial treatments. If you have to spend all your time liming lakes that are acidic and spending money on chemicals, what's the point of it? Why not just write that area off and work somewhere else? Well, the Sudbury story showed this, is that this area was never limed. It was simply treated with clean air. And those same amazing bacteria that mine our sulfur-reducing bacteria, they generate their own alkalinity and can deacidify a lake simply by taking the pressure off it. And this is one of the longest running acid rain monitoring sites on Earth. In Clearwater Lake, and it's set aside in the official plan of the city as a barometer of health. And it shows that good regulations, legislation, air quality, nature, if given a chance, can heal herself. And that's the message Dr. Jane Goodall brings. So as any good scientist, you have to publish and report, and these are some of the textbooks and other things that I've produced over the years of doing this for a long time now. But more than 1,000 publications have been shared from the Sudbury story around the world to give encouragement and explain the mechanisms of this system. You can look these up, but you can also now obtain this information from online courses. This is the environmental remediation course, and if you just look up that title on YouTube, you can gain access to those as well. So that that's now being offered in 3 languages, in French, English, and Spanish for the South American crowd. One thing we learned early on is it's a hard slug, and you only make progress in, so you need a lot of parties and some fun involved here, and you need a role for everybody. So artists like to paint, and filmmakers need to make films, and poets. We have a very large active poetry community in Sudbury, if you can believe that. Margaret Atwood came for 10 years in a row to have her birthday party at our place and celebrate and made the first donations to build our research center. So poetry, music, dance. There's a earth dance group that celebrates regreening through dance, and all of that is valuable. And as I say, one that we're doing just now is the amazing Dr. Goodall, Time Magazine Woman of the Year, UN Ambassador for Peace. She has adopted Sudbury as one of her 4 great hope stories around the world. And there's me acting with her in a canoe. We're releasing fish in one of the lakes, and then here she is again with Indigenous kids releasing another group of fish in one of the restored lakes. And it was a huge honor and an amazing woman to spend time with in the work. She's 88 years old and travels nearly to 300 events per year. So has no home but Pearson Airport, so, or other places where you'd hate to spend your life. So you need partners on all this work, and that's just a smattering of sort of the partners that come to this. And you want to see your work have impact. And when I was at COP15 presenting this, I had delegates from the Democratic Republic of the Congo come up and interrupt me or through the Q&A session and say, well, it's good enough for you Canadians to talk this way. You're a rich country, but your own mining companies destroy our country. What can you do about the companies that you're celebrating here? They don't behave that way in our country. Is that right? So what is a speaker supposed to do with a thing like that? Well, I picked up the phone and called the president of Glencore and said, it's not right. You know, I'm a Canada Research Chair. My salary is protected. I can do whatever I like. And that was an important phone call. He said it, I'm at those boardroom tables. Good to hear from you. And the other one is, I called up the mayor who's standing there holding the microphone, Paul Lefebvre, and said, Sudbury is a big city, a big municipality. It's about as big as a municipality of about There's 20 countries smaller than our municipality. Can't we meet the minister's challenge? Minister said that Canada should have 30% in preserves by 2030. Well, it's easy work if you're just going to identify, parts of Baffin Island and northern areas where nobody's fighting over anything. Can you do that within the city boundaries of Montreal? Can you make 30% by 30? Probably not, but I asked our mayor, and our mayor is standing there announcing that by 2030, he's dedicated to setting 30% of the city of Sudbury aside as parks and preserves, and to deal with the arguments that go with those kinds of announcements. So, and the university in financial difficulty on Earth Day, you're the first to know it, we'll be announcing that we will join Oxford University of being a nature positive university, similar to what McGill pledged at the conference in Montreal. But as young lawyers, you should be asking McGill, in fact, are you doing that? Is your procurement policy meeting the energy needs of the world without destroying things? Are you divesting from fossil fuel investments at McGill? I would expect the first answer to the divesting in your fossil fuel investments has probably not happened yet. So as a class assignment, I would ask you to have that done before the year is out, is call up your president, tell them you want to divest, that you sign the McGill, you've already signed the agreement. So show us the evidence at the next board meeting that you're removing yourself from companies that are destroying things, and especially in Africa and other places. So I'll leave it there. If you have any questions, I don't know whether I'm got any time left, but I'm happy to take any questions from you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gunn. I'm just going to end the recording so that if people don't want to